On the 6th of June 1985, 15-year-old Marco Aurelio Simon, accompanied by his father, Ivo, his twin brother, Antonio, and scout leader, Juan Bernabeu Céspedes, would arrive at the Tatuape metro terminal in Sao Paulo. It was at this station that Marco would unknowingly say goodbye to Ivo and Antonio for the final time. From Sao Paulo, Marco and Juan would board the Piquete bus and head towards the city of Lorena, before transitioning again and then heading to their final destination of Piquete, where they would meet the 3 other Boy Scouts. This was actually a very big day for these 4 scouts of the Olivtano Scout Group, as Marco, along with the others, Ricardo, Osvaldo and Ramatis, were going to increase their rank by ascending the Pico dos Marins mountain. The peak of the mountain stands at around 2,400 meters. All involved were excited about this chance to become senior Boy Scouts, and they were ready for the challenge, though they were well aware that this was by no means an easy task. However, they had been preparing themselves for this for quite some time now, and the scout leader, Juan, believed that they all held the necessary survival skills, were fit enough, and were ready to take this head on. Juan actually knew Marco and the rest of his family well, being considered a family friend. I believe that Juan and Marco's father had been friends for a long time. Marco had an awful lot to be proud of. He was considered one of the best scouts among them, and he had achieved the most amount of badges and had worked for this spot to ascend the mountain. Marco unfortunately suffered from strabismus, which meant that his vision was impaired quite significantly in his left eye, which may have been one of the reasons as to why he felt that he had to work so hard for this. As you might imagine, this condition was a large cause of concern for his parents, who didn't like the thought of Marco going out on such trips without them, but Marco very much wanted to prove that he could overcome this challenge in life and be just as independent as everyone else. This trip, however, would soon take an unforeseen turn and would become one of the strangest incidents to have ever occurred in Brazil. At some point around 12:30 PM on the 6th of June that year, the bus had left and was well on its way back to Piquete, leaving Marco, Juan and the 3 of the scouts standing not too far from the base of the mountain. The 5 of them met Alfonso Xavier, an experienced guide who lived right next to the mountain, in close proximity to where they were dropped off. Alfonso lived with his wife, Maria, and his 3 children. They had a great relationship with the scout group, and Alfonso gave them some advice while talking for a while. Juan had planned to get the scouts acclimated to their new environment by staying around the base for the first 2 days, and would then ascend the mountain on the 3rd day, the 8th. Because of these plans, Alfonso picked them out a good camping spot nearby his property, and said that they were more than welcome to camp there for the first 2 nights if they so wished. Juan thought this was a great idea and thanked Alfonso. He tasked the scouts with setting up their base camp, and they then spent the rest of the day exploring, setting up their tents and gathering some firewood. The scouts hopped in a nearby body of water while the sun was still out, and after a good swim, they retired to the camp for some food and warmth from the fire. Even at the ground level, as the sun began to set, the temperature dropped to around freezing. As the group were relaxing in their own tents and trying to sleep, they would have heard the crackling of the fire while they drifted off. While they were sleeping, something unusual would happen at the campsite. On the morning of the 7th, it became apparent that something had happened overnight. Ricardo, one of the scouts, exited his tent and saw that his boots, which he'd placed inside a plastic bag to keep them dry, had been removed. Similarly, they had left an oil can outside the tent, and it was described as leaning on a sloped surface, but now it was empty, and there was no evidence as to where the contents had been poured or spilled. The empty can was found next to Ricardo's boots, and all of these items mentioned were in the direction of and nearer to Alfonso's house. Obviously, the group were now worried about the idea that they might have been robbed overnight, so they quickly began taking inventory of everything they had. But they came to the conclusion that pretty much all of their belongings were still intact. It wasn't only the oil that had vanished though. Alongside this, the group discovered that a couple of the lids to their lunchboxes had gone missing, along with a fork, some eggs, and some butter. There are conflicting reports in the press about what the outcome of this was. Some state that Juan spoke to Alfonso, who stated that it might have been some stray dogs that had rummaged around, as he, nor his family, or the scouts for that matter, had seen anyone else that day. Other outlets suggested that Juan kept this information to himself, as he didn't want to freak out the rest of the group. Either way though, Osvaldo, another one of the scouts, stated that on the night that the items disappeared, he had felt uneasy for some reason, but he wasn't fully aware of as to why. It seems reasonable to me as to why he might have felt a bit off. He was in an unfamiliar place, and he knew that in the coming days there was going to be a rather difficult task ahead. Or perhaps the way Osvaldo was feeling was a very primal gut instinct that something was wrong. Juan also believed that he had felt something hit his tent that night, but upon checking there was nothing there, so afterwards he tried to get some sleep. In any case, after collecting Ricardo's boots, the group got some breakfast ready together, and despite the weirdness, they were in a good mood for one more easy day of fun before actually ascending the mountain. The 7th of June was spent much like the 6th. The group scouted for some firewood, and for the most part, Juan was just giving them a chance to get the lay of the land, so to speak. That night, the scout group circled around the fire, where Juan told them of the plans for the following day. He gave Marco a leadership position. I'm not entirely sure what this entailed, but I believe that Marco was to have a say in relation to navigating when on the mountain, and also under Juan's supervision was given some responsibilities to ensure the group's safety. The big day came around on the 8th, and the scouts awoke that morning to find that Juan wasn't among them, though he soon returned. In the meantime, they sat together and talked for a while with some breakfast. Juan arrived and told them that the moment that they'd been preparing for all these months was finally here, and that soon they were going to start the ascent. This was a round trip that should have taken around 6 hours or so in total. It was around 9:30 in the morning, and now they began walking towards the trailhead that would take them directly to Morro de Careca, the point of the mountain that would allow them to climb it. But for some reason, Juan deviated from this main trail and had the group hike a separate dirt road instead. It's never been made clear if this was just a mistake or if he wanted to work the scouts a little harder. Whatever the case may be, the scouts arrived at Morro de Careca at 1:30 PM, around 4 hours after setting off. This is a trip that would usually have taken just over an hour or so had they stuck to the trail. There were also other groups that were supposed to be climbing the mountain that day, and this diversion now meant that the Boy Scouts would be completely isolated by themselves, as the other groups would be hours ahead of them up the mountain. Upon their arrival, they noticed that there was a tent set up near a now extinguished fire in the bush. Juan called out to see if anyone was inside the tent, but they never got a response. So I suppose either someone was sleeping in there or was hiking and planned to return later. In any case, the initial part of the trail up the mountain was a gentle incline, though as they ascended, the path grew steeper and the soft earth gave way to more rugged terrain of exposed roots and scattered rocks. These formed natural, uneven steps, demanding more attention and effort to navigate the laid out paths safely. As they got higher, the trees began to thin, offering glimpses of the valley beneath them. Their conversations quieted as they concentrated on their footing, which will have been replaced by a rhythmic crunch of their boots on the gravelly path. The higher they got, the cooler the air would have been with lower temperatures. Though despite how tired they were due to the longer route they'd taken to reach the mountain, they had been making good time. The scouts were about halfway up and they would have been able to see the top of the mountain. They navigated to a section where the path narrowed and was strewn with loose rocks and cracks that were obscured. At around 2 PM, around 1200 meters in elevation, Osvaldo, perhaps momentarily distracted by the incredible view that they would have had, or perhaps was just a victim of the rugged terrain, took an ill-placed step. His boot, instead of finding solid ground beneath it, plunged downwards into a small crevice that he couldn't see. Osvaldo lunged downwards and felt a sharp tearing sensation that snaked its way up his leg, and propelled by his momentum, seemed to have hurt himself quite badly. Thankfully, this wasn't a life-threatening injury, though it must have been quite painful as Osvaldo screamed out. In his position, he'd gotten stuck, and as the others helped him out, it was revealed that he couldn't put any weight on his foot. I think specifically, his knee had sustained the injury and was hurt quite badly. Juan obviously realised that they couldn't go any further and needed to get back down to Alfonso as soon as possible. With each arm over Juan and Marco's shoulder, they helped him hop to some shade where they sat down and began to devise a plan. Of course, by this time, everyone was panicked and concerned for Osvaldo, who was clearly in discomfort and pain. Juan tried to keep a straight face though, and reassured the scouts that everything was going to be fine and they were going to make it back down to Alfonso's where they could call to get some help. The skills of the scouts actually came in handy here, and after gathering some sticks together with their rope, they were able to improvise a makeshift stretcher. Given the talk that they had the night prior, where Marco was given some extra responsibilities, I get the sense that he felt that he had a sense of duty to get Osvaldo to safety. Juan's plan was to have Marco scout back the way they came a short distance to get an idea of the safest route back down that they could take. Marco agreed to this at first, but then said that actually, if he left by himself, he could still do this, but also make it all the way down to Alfonso's house by himself where he could call for help, and essentially have medical professionals waiting at the base camp by the time the rest of them made it down. The rest of the group weren't really in favour of this and preferred the idea of staying together, but Marco was adamant that this was the right call. I think Juan was in panic mode because he realised that this was ultimately his responsibility and fault. So because of his headspace, I don't think he was capable of making the best decisions at that time. He approved of Marco's plan and told him to mark the large rocks on his descent with a piece of chalk so that they could follow his precise path. Marco was to write the scout group identification number 240 on these rocks, all the way down to the campsite. Juan and the others lifted Osvaldo onto the stretcher and began following in Marco's footsteps. Every so often, Marco would also use his scout whistle so that the group knew of his approximate direction and location from them. Juan, however, was about to make yet another questionable decision. As Marco was descending the mountain and marking the stones as requested, he was faced with a fork in the trail. He had made it clear with his markings that he had taken the path on the left. Juan decided that the terrain to the right looked easier to traverse while carrying Osvaldo, and I believe that he thought that the trail would converge again. I can appreciate that this likely was not an easy decision, but now, this meant that not only had one of the scouts become injured under his watch, he had now essentially made the decision to completely split off from another young scout. And let's not forget that Marco had a vision impairment, which unfortunately meant that despite his impressive skill set, he was always going to be considered somewhat more vulnerable than the others. This also had the knock-on effect of making the decision to have Marco go on ahead somewhat diminished. In hindsight, and probably with some better judgment overall, it would just have been more appropriate and safer had they have stuck together. After all, while Osvaldo was obviously in pain and a lot of discomfort, his life was not at risk here. So, if turning right on the trail was safer overall, and Juan was able to ascertain this right away, then obviously all of them should have gone that way, Marco included, which also would have made carrying Osvaldo easier too. In any case, it was reported that the other scouts weren't exactly happy with this second decision, and seemed to share similar thoughts to my critique. But to them, they'd known Juan for a long time, and believed that he knew best, and they trusted his judgment. The path they'd taken was a longer route compared to the one Marco had taken, and would extend the time it took to reach the base camp by a significant amount. Despite the fact that Juan thought that the right-hand path would be easier, they still had to navigate through dense forestry and some very steep sections of the trail at times. As said, it was 2 PM when Osvaldo became injured, and now they had been at this for hours and it was getting dark. With that darkness came significantly lower temperatures, and they would have known that this was a bad situation now, as the previous nights had been around freezing, and now they were even higher in elevation. In the early hours of the 9th, it was completely pitch black, though they were able to continue on with the use of their flashlights. They hadn't eaten very much, they were cold, shivering, and were low on water. They hadn't brought many supplies because this was supposed to be a round trip. They hadn't planned on remaining on the mountain for too long. They were also all worried about Marco as they hadn't heard his whistle in hours, presumably just thinking that he'd made it all the way back down. Juan and the group didn't have a great idea as to precisely where they were in the darkness, but they came across a property in the middle of nowhere and called in for assistance. I'm not sure precisely where this property was, but a farmer came out and greeted them. It was explained to Juan that they had come down in completely the wrong direction and were now in the direction of Minas. Alfonso's house was around 6 kilometers or just shy of 4 miles away. They now knew the direction that they were supposed to be travelling, and by 5 AM they made it back to the campsite not far from Alfonso's house. Bear in mind that this was now around 20 hours after initially heading up the mountain in the first place, and around 15 hours since they lost track of Marco. There was a major problem though. Juan took one look at their tents and knew that something had happened. There are two conflicting reports. Some outlets suggest that the campsite was in disarray with tents torn down, while others state that it was simply obvious that their tents had been rummaged through and some of their possessions had been flung out. Either way, Marco's backpack was among the items and it had been opened. They initially suspected that Marco himself must have been looking through it and was likely nearby somewhere. They began calling out for him, but at no point did they receive a response. It was still dark at this point, and the group warmed up at their campsite, and about an hour and a half later, Juan left the camp in search of Marco. For some reason, Juan had not reported what had happened to Alfonso, and it's not clear why this was the case. It seems reasonable that, given the circumstances, it would have been appropriate to wake Alfonso and his family, but this did not happen. I can only imagine that Juan must have been panicking and realised that this was all his fault. You've got one scout injured and one missing, and nobody has been told, so therefore no calls have been made to seek help. Instead, Juan searched the immediate area for around 4 hours and returned to the camp at 10:30 AM without any success. Of course, when the police would later arrive, the fact that Juan did not immediately report all of this to Alfonso to get help made him the primary suspect at the start of the investigation. In addition to this, Juan had made another questionable decision that led to a point of contention with the police. Earlier, I made the point that on the morning when the scouts were about to ascend the mountain, Juan was not among them, but soon returned to them. While Juan was away from the camp, he had gone to speak to Alfonso, and this conversation, as a result of the police investigation, came out with two versions. There was Juan's account where he stated that he asked if Alfonso would guide them up, but allegedly he said that Alfonso had told him that he was too busy. Alfonso, however, was saying the opposite, that he was ready to go and offered his services of accompanying the group, but Juan said no and that his presence wouldn't be necessary. Both parties maintained that their version of events was correct, so of course somebody was lying. The authorities just had no way to know for sure who it was. I would point this out though. I wonder if Juan wanted himself and the group to be alone on their ascent, because he also directed them the long way to the mountain trail, meaning that all the other groups who were going up around the time that they were supposed to were already gone and well underway. From reading the reports, I don't believe that there was necessarily anything nefarious or bad about this intention. There are nuanced situations in which this can make sense. I used to work with young people with special educational needs and behavioural problems, for example, and there were many times on trips that I would try to create a similar situation to split groups up to control behaviour and make things a little smoother. I'm absolutely certain that the young people involved in this situation weren't poorly behaved at all, but there still could have been a good reason in Juan's mind to have done this. Perhaps to avoid distraction, or perhaps it could have just been his own ego problems where he wanted to dictate how things went. Interestingly, I also believe that Marco's father was under the impression that Juan wouldn't be attempting this alone, but thought that Alfonso was joining and going up with them, alongside another scout group as well. In any case, after searching around the campsite, Juan found no trace whatsoever. Then he made another odd decision. Again, instead of reporting the disappearance straight away to Alfonso so they could get help, he instead went to his tent and waited for the scheduled bus driver to arrive. This is among the worst series of decisions, one right after another, that I think I've ever come across. I've reported on an awful lot of disappearances at this point, and somehow in this situation, every decision was ill thought out. I can only think that what we're witnessing is an ego problem coupled with panic. I get the impression that Juan recognised this was all his fault, but was not ready to admit that there was an actual problem, as that would mean facing these responsibilities head on. It would have all become very real, so to speak. Speculating aside, when the driver, Paulino, arrived, Juan told him about what had happened. Juan told Paulino to contact a scout group in Piquete. I can only assume that Osvaldo left with Paulino at this point and met back up with his parents. Anyway, the leader in question was Sebastião Augusto Ramos, and he came with a team of 6, including himself. As they were searching the surrounding areas to the camp, the weather worsened with heavy rain and cold temperatures, meaning that this was now prime hypothermia territory. Somehow, the police had still not been notified, and I can only imagine that Sebastião must have talked some sense into Juan, because at 5:30 PM they raced to Alfonso's house where the police were then notified, almost 30 hours after the initial point of separation. This was the absolute worst scenario now because the weather prevented an effective organisation to the search. So while people were looking that night, it was only able to get off the ground the following morning. So Marco would have had to have spent the entire night on a freezing cold, wet mountain area alone. It did not have to be that way if Juan had have acted sooner. Now, something strange was about to happen, so let's get bizarre. Alfonso allowed Juan, Ramatis and Ricardo to stay at his home as they wanted to join the major search effort that was set to begin the following morning. At 7 PM, all concerned found themselves in Alfonso's kitchen where they were eating soup that Maria had prepared. It is at this point that all of them reported a peculiar event. Coming from the bush outside, they all reported hearing loud, persistent whistling coming from beyond the tree line that the scouts were certain sounded just like their whistles. Of course, with that, everybody assumed that this was Marco, as he obviously had his whistle on his person and to them was likely using it to call for help as he must have gotten lost. Juan, Alfonso and Ricardo sprinted out the door and towards the sound in a mad frenzy. In the words of the group, as they were chasing after the sound of the whistle, at the height of the treetops they saw 3 flashes of blue light and the whistling stopped. The group called out to Marco and shouted to keep whistling so that they could find him, but they received no response. Now surrounded by the darkness, illuminated only by their flashlights, they continued yelling out to Marco, but they were met with nothing but silence. Juan then started to use his own whistle loudly to allow Marco to head in their direction, but there was nothing. The group looked on in confusion and searched the area for a number of hours without any success. It's not clear what they must have been thinking while this was happening. Juan and Ricardo were convinced that the blue lights were nearby, while Alfonso believed that the lights must have come from the distant city. Perhaps Juan was thinking that other people with flashlights may have gotten to and taken Marco. After all, there was some weirdness on the first night that they slept, and then again when they returned to the campsite, stating that it had been tampered with. Though at the time, as said, they seemed to believe that Marco must have rummaged through his own backpack for some reason. Either way though, one of the largest searches to have ever happened in Brazil took place over the next 28 days for Marco. After the governor heard about what had happened, he would have the military get involved in the search, and they put around 200 boots on the ground. In addition, there were search and rescue professionals, law enforcement, search dog teams, aircraft, among other organisations, and of course, many volunteers. This search was absolutely massive in scale, but despite this, no sign of Marco was ever found. The scouts' steps were retraced, right back to the point of the fork in the trail. Professional searchers with dogs went down the left path, and they noted that Marco had only marked 3 rocks, and then for one reason or another had stopped doing it. It's just interesting to note here that the search dogs at no point ever found Marco's scent. This was also interesting because Marco was a reliable young man, he took this seriously, and he knew to mark the rocks all the way down to the camp, as he'd agreed. But for one reason or another, he stopped. Why? There was no evidence left behind, of course, to insinuate why he might have stopped. However, there can only really exist 3 answers to this question. Firstly, and some might suggest, that he stopped because something must have happened to him right then and there on that path down the mountain. Of course, this can't have been animal predation because there would have been very obvious evidence left behind. The second option was that there was no direct incident on the path, as the lack of evidence might insinuate, but instead, for one reason or another, he began to feel uneasy, or believed that he had reason for concern. Could he have spotted someone or a group that he didn't like the look of? Or perhaps he saw an animal and he was not so physically pushed from the path and then got lost. It's not really clear, or I suppose this brings us to the third option. He strayed from the trail and got thoroughly lost and so panicked that marking the rocks was no longer a priority, or even helpful actually. Although, as pointed out, when Juan and the others finally reached their camp at 5 in the morning, they revealed that someone, and believed it was Marco himself, had rummaged through his backpack and left it outside the tent. Though this calls other things into question. If this was Marco that made it back to the camp, why on earth wouldn't he have made Alfonso aware of everything that had happened? Given the type of person that Marco was, I believe he would have done just that, only it didn't happen. So, was it even Marco that made it back to the camp, or had someone else been in there? I don't believe there was ever any evidence to suggest who exactly had been looking through Marco's backpack. But if it was Marco, what a very unusual decision to have made to then run back off into the forest. If it was him, I can only imagine that he was bothered by something and felt the need to hide or get away. The fact that Marco had only managed to mark 3 of the rocks is an obvious clue to something happening here, but it is difficult to draw a conclusion based on that. No one could ascertain why he would have stopped. I wonder if his whistling on the way down was actually a sign that he was in trouble, and the group misread that situation as him letting them know where he was. But that is just speculation, of course. As said, Juan was a suspect for a while, and he was subject to intense scrutiny and suspicion. His judgments were obviously widely questioned, because many were in agreement that at best he was incredibly irresponsible. After a thorough investigation, law enforcement came to the conclusion that he had not done anything to Marco outside of said terrible decision making. The other scouts had also spoken to the investigators and said that Juan did not have bad intentions towards Marco. Alfonso was questioned alongside a separate scout group who was also somewhere in the surrounding areas, but they had not seen Marco. Authorities did not believe that they had anything to do with it either. One guide said that the search was so massive and that they entered every possible area that they could have, and that if Marco was not found, it meant that he must not be in the area anymore, which I'm sure must have been a feeling shared by many. It's not clear what happened to him. There are those who believe that he must have gotten lost and then succumbed to the elements after the weather made a turn for the worse. Others believe that there must have been some kind of third party responsible. I personally would like to know more about these lights. It is a very strange coincidence that those present heard someone using their whistle. Everybody believed that it was Marco signalling that he needed help or was lost, or something along those lines. But when they were travelling in the direction of these noises, they saw 3 flashes of blue light, and afterwards the whistling came to an end. It's very difficult to know what to do with that information. If it wasn't Marco whistling, just who was it? I have seen a fair bit of speculation over this, in all different directions. I've seen discussions that point to the potential of someone, or perhaps a group, having earlier taken Marco and then toying with those who were in Alfonso's house at the time. Perhaps the flashes of light could have been a signal by those with bad intentions to stop whistling as Juan, Alfonso and Ricardo had gotten close enough. Though that is total speculation, and Alfonso argued that he believed that the lights were emanating from a distant town. It's very difficult to know what to make of that. One thing I am fairly sure of though, is that if it was Marco whistling in those moments, and there was nothing else happening here, then he would have been found by the group. There is clearly a piece of missing information here. Now, 5 years after vanishing, in 1990, the authorities closed the case, which marked the end of the active official investigation. For Marco's family, it was not over, and they continued searching for many years, though they were never able to acquire the answers that they were looking for. Interestingly, something weird was also reported at the time of Marco's disappearance. His mother was visiting a ranch at the time that he went missing, and while at the ranch, she said that she had a strong, bad feeling, and because of this, she ended her visit early and went home. This was before Juan went missing, which seems like a very bizarre coincidence that's difficult to explain. The case was reopened briefly in 2021, brought about by a claim that Alfonso's daughter, right before passing away herself, had said that Marco's disappearance was caused by one of her brothers. According to these claims, Marco arrived at Alfonso's house seeking help on the day of his disappearance, but her brother, who had some kind of psychiatric disorder, then lashed out. The police did respond to this and searched through the entire property again and found nothing. They also came to the conclusion that these statements were only rumours, and probably were not even made by Alfonso's daughter. Police Chief Fabio Cabet denied the audio circulating on apps that say Alfonso would have buried Marco to protect his son. However, the person responsible for the audio said nothing of the sort. Now, we can't be too careful. This information only hinders our work. Or in other words, this may have been some kind of cruel joke or rumour, I suppose. Unfortunately, despite the passing of 40 years now, all the fundamental questions surrounding what happened to Marco do not have a clear answer. What do you think happened after he set off down that left trail? With that brings us to the end of this. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. If you found this video interesting, please do remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you didn't like it, then feel free to give me a thumbs down. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day, or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys, peace.